Hi, my name is Neil Gorman. I am a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Illinois. I am somebody who has a master's in social work and a doctorate in social work from Aurora University School of Social Work. I am a practicing Lacanian psychoanalyst. I'm a member of the World Association of Psychoanalysis, the New Lacanian School, and the Lacanian Compass. And I am the kind of person who makes things like podcasts that people can listen to and now videos that people can watch, and I put them out on the internet. So, what is this thing that you're listening to or watching right now? It is a podcast and now a series of YouTube videos called Social Psychoanalytic Work. And what this thing is an attempt to take my knowledge and my preoccupation with two things and kind of put them together. So the first thing, if we imagine this is like an intersection, imagine a road going, up and down like this vertically. Let's call that road clinical social work. And now let's imagine that there's another road going, horizontally like this, intersecting that first one. And let's call that one psychoanalytic theory and practice, right? These two things converge, and that intersection of clinical social work and psychoanalytic practice and theory, that's the thing that I'm really interested in. That's the thing that I'm going to spend some time talking about on this podcast and in these videos. Let me give you a little bit of background here. So, in addition to getting my graduate degrees from the Aurora University School of Social Work, I was also a professor there in some way or form for like 12 years. I started out as an adjunct professor while I was getting my doctorate. And then after doing that for like 4-ish years, I transitioned to being a full-time professor, a full-time academic. And while I was doing that, while I was teaching, almost every semester, sometimes more than once a semester, I would teach a specific class that was called Social Work 6521, SWK 6521. That was the course number. And the title of the course changed a lot over time, but the title that it had probably for the longest time was Advanced Clinical Social Work. And that class was a broad overview of different psychoanalytic, which is sometimes called psychodynamic. My class was this broad overview of psychoanalytic theories. It went from Freud to ego psychology to object relations to self psychology, and then it ended with Lacan and Lacanian psychoanalysis. So lots and lots and lots of big theories were contained in this one 16-week course. It was an overview. I never ended up going really deep on any one of these psychological theories, but that's what I did. And for many years, I taught that class in a fairly normal way, which means class would start. I would do a lecture that was based off of some reading that I expected students to have done prior to class. And, after doing a lecture, what I would do is I would open things up for larger kinds of discussions about the content. I wanted students to raise their questions, their comments, their criticisms, their concerns about whatever it was that they had read and that I had lectured about. It was a kind of, I guess, hybrid between lecture and seminar style classes. And it worked for the most part. I liked teaching that way, and not every student liked it, but I'd say a pretty large number of students tended to prefer that style as well. Well, then in the year 2020, COVID happens and everybody gets sent home from their jobs and from school. And the university got the professors together and was like, hey, you guys are going to use this thing called Zoom to teach classes. And while I was doing that, one of the things that I decided to do was to take the lectures that I was giving. Because I guess, I don't know if this will make sense as I say it. I hope it will. I thought the idea of logging on to Zoom and then just watching this little tiny box, or if you had it set a different way, a somewhat larger box of a talking head, just tell you things didn't seem like it would be good. I thought, I don't want to do it that way. I don't think that's going to work for me. And if it's not working for me, it's probably not going to work for the students. And so what I decided to do was switch things up, and I still did my lectures, but I took my lectures and I recorded them And I released the audio files of those lectures to the students so that they could do their reading and then listen to my lecture before we would meet on Zoom. And then I took the Zoom time and I tried to maximize the discussion as much as possible. That was my idea. That's how I wanted things to go at that time. I recorded my lectures, I put them out. At first, only my students had access to them. And the plan worked okay. It worked more than it didn't work. It worked okay. And a bunch of the students who I had said that they liked the lectures. Not all of them liked them, I'm sure, but some took the time to come to me and say, like, hey, we like these lectures. And right now, once we're not in the class, it's kind of difficult for us to continue to have access to them. Is there any way that you'd be willing to put these things out so that we could have them later? And I thought about it and I said, yeah, sure, why not? And I decided, you know what, I'll just put them out on the open internet in the form of a podcast that people can get through Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever. And they went out onto the internet. And I didn't think that much about it, but over time, I started to get emails from people who were not my students and never had been my students because they started listening to these podcasts and they had questions, comments, answers, criticisms, concerns about the content on the podcast. And I was like, oh, wow, this is kind of neat. People are actually engaging with this stuff. That's nice. And at a certain point, I decided that I needed to stop teaching at the university that I was teaching at. There were a lot of reasons that I decided that. The main reason was just that I have young kids and it was really hard for me to be available in the way I wanted to be available to my kids and to teach at a university and to have a clinical practice. I couldn't do all three of those things. I decided that I definitely wanted to keep being a very active parent and I definitely wanted to keep up my clinical practice. And although continuing to teach would have been nice, it just didn't fit in my life. And so I was like, you know what, I'm going to stop doing this. And so there was a point where I stopped and walked away from it. It wasn't a dramatic thing. I'm still on, I think, pretty good terms with the people who were at the university where I was teaching, both the administration and the professors and some of the former students and stuff like that. So that wasn't like contentious, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But I left. And even after I left, I continued to get these emails from people saying that they'd listen to my podcast. And some of these people who were listening to my podcast and who reached out to me eventually became patients in my clinical practice. So it turned out to be this thing that, from my perspective, produces some kind of interest in people. It is something that some people find useful. And for a long time, really long time, I have been thinking about doing a second season of this podcast. I haven't done it just because life is life. I have a lot going on. I'm a busy person. If you're listening to this, if you're watching this, I'm willing to bet dollars to donuts that you too are a pretty busy person. And I just never felt like I had the time and the energy in sufficient amounts to sit down and make this second season of the podcast. I planned it out. I have a very extensive outline of things that I thought would be cool to talk about in a second season of the podcast, but I never got around to taking that outline and turning it into what came after making an outline, which is a series of podcasts or videos. But things have changed a little bit in my life. And I think that and hope that I will have the requisite time and energy to make another season of this podcast. And today is the first day that I'm putting that to the test. I sat down here in my office where I see patients. I set up my gear, plugged in the microphone, and set up a camera. I'll say something about that. So the first season of this podcast is audio only. It's just a podcast. There's no video. I didn't want to make videos because I thought that making videos is probably hard. And I didn't want to add more work for myself because I was really busy. But I've been thinking about it and I've decided I'm going to try making videos and audio at the same time. So you can now watch this podcast on YouTube, if that's your thing, or you can just listen to it as audio if that's more your speed. What are some other differences that you're going to notice about the second season of this podcast/video thing? Well, in the first season, which was very much determined by the curriculum of the course that I was teaching, I tended to structure things where I started with a theory or theorist or group of theorists, and I would talk about the major concepts in the theory. I would probably talk about the biography of the theorist because I thought that that oftentimes was useful information and helped students understand why the theory was constructed the way it was constructed. So here's the person who made the theory. Here's kind of what was going on in their life at the time that they made it. Personal stuff, if I knew that. Larger macro social stuff that was going on, if I knew that. And then what I'm going to do is move into some of the big concepts of the theory itself and talk about that. And finally, at the very end, I would move into more technical stuff. I would talk about the way that this theory could be transitioned into actual clinical practice, or what we would call clinical technique or techniques, things that a therapist, a social worker, a psychoanalyst could do as they engaged with their patients. That was the kind of order of operations in that first season. And in the second season, I don't want to continue to do things that way. Instead, what I want to do in the second season is assume that if you're listening to this or watching this, that you already have some level of knowledge about psychoanalytic theory and psychoanalytic practice. Doesn't have to be a huge amount of knowledge, but that you have some level of knowledge, that you're not somebody who's a complete novice. That I'm going to assume that you've either done your own work, you've learned about this stuff in your own way, or that you've already listened to the first season of this podcast, and that you're coming here with some knowledge. And because I'm assuming that you have that knowledge, I'm going to speak as if you have it. And what I'm going to do is try to articulate my personal kind of clinical style. And what I mean by that is that I'm going to attempt to describe to you, to put into words, the way that I practice. And in doing that, I'm going to talk to you about the techniques that I use and to some degree explain the thought process behind why I use those techniques and why I use them in the way that I use them. And my hope is that people will hear that information and that they will find it useful, that they will find it interesting in some way. If you're listening to this stuff and you're hearing what I'm saying and you just think this is boring, it is not useful, it is stupid, it is irrelevant, this guy is just, I don't want to listen to him anymore. My apologies for wasting your time. I'm sure that there's plenty of other things on the internet that you can find to watch or listen to. And I hope that you like listening to those things and watching those things. If you are somebody who finds the stuff that I'm talking about interesting and useful, I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that you're listening. I'm glad that you're watching. I will hope to create content that will continue to captivate you in some way. So there we go. This episode is now pretty much done. I have described a bunch of stuff, and I am also using this as an attempt to set up this gear and record the audio, record the video at the same time and see how that turns out. I'm going to put the audio out on the podcast feed. I'm going to put the video up on YouTube. And that is that. Thank you for taking the time to listen or watch or both of those things. If you listened and watched, I don't know why you did that, but thank you. My name is Neil Gorman. This is Social Psychoanalytic Work, the beginning of season 2. Stay tuned for the next episode where we will talk about things and stuff. And please, please, please make some beautiful mistakes. Take care.